Lola Davier was born on July 18, 2010 in France, to a family that by every account was built on love, laughter, and quiet devotion. Her parents, Johan and Deline, had created something many families only dream of: a home filled with warmth, stability, and a sense of togetherness that endured through every small difficulty life threw at them. Deline often described her daughter with a kind of wonder in her voice. Lola was bright-eyed, affectionate, and deeply joyful, the kind of child who found delight in the simplest moments. She had fair hair and soft blue eyes, and looked so much like her mother that Deline, with a tenderness she could never quite put into words, used to call her little mirror image. Growing up, Lola was surrounded by her older brothers, Jordan and Thibaut, who kept a watchful, gentle eye over their younger sister. Deline described the family as tightly bound, the kind of unit that might argue from time to time, as all families do, but never for long. The disagreements never left a mark. They always found their way back to each other. Johan, she said, was a devoted father in the truest sense, a man who would do absolutely anything for his children without hesitation or complaint. When the time came to build a better future for the family, Johan and Deline made the decision to relocate to Paris. They found work as resident caretakers in a 12-story apartment building in the 19th arrondissement, one of the city's more densely populated northeastern districts. Life there was modest in material terms, but extraordinarily rich in everything that actually mattered. On weekends, the family would go camping together, packing up the car and heading somewhere quiet and green, away from the hum of the city. At home, they gathered around the table for simple, comforting meals, sometimes nothing more than a plate of golden fries, which somehow always felt like a celebration. Lola loved roaming the grounds of the building with the family's Yorkshire Terrier, a small and spirited dog named Daisy. That routine, those familiar rituals and small pleasures, remained largely unchanged for 6 years. It was a life that felt, in the best possible way, like enough. Lola had found her own passions along the way. She was deeply committed to gymnastics, attending training sessions with the kind of focus and enthusiasm that made her coaches and parents proud. At school, she had built a tight-knit circle of 3 close friends, girls who were a little mischievous, full of laughter, and completely devoted to one another. One of those friends would later recall that she had known Lola since first grade, that Lola had been the very first person to befriend her after she moved to a new school. That kind of generosity, that instinct to reach out to someone who felt lost, was entirely in character. Friday, October 14, 2022 began like any other day in the Davier household. Deline was busy packing for a camping trip the family had planned for the weekend, one of those outings they all looked forward to. After lunch, she lay down for a short rest, confident that the afternoon would unfold as it always did. Lola was expected home from school at around 2:40 in the afternoon, but 2:40 came and went, and the door never opened. When Deline woke from her nap, she felt something she had never felt before at that hour: a cold, creeping unease that she could not explain or dismiss. "This isn't normal," she told her husband immediately. "This isn't like her." By 3 o'clock, Johan had already called the school. The staff told him that Lola had left the building on time and had been seen walking in the direction of home. She had made it out of the school gates, but she never arrived. Deline later described the feeling that settled over her in those early hours with devastating clarity. From the very moment she did not respond, she said she knew. Something was wrong. Something had happened. She did not wait. She took a photograph of Lola and walked to the nearest police station to report her daughter missing. What happened next added a layer of anguish to an already unbearable situation. Officers at the station were initially reluctant to treat the disappearance as urgent. They suggested, not unkindly but with the detachment of routine procedure, that the 12-year-old had probably wandered off somewhere, perhaps with a boy, and would find her way home before long. Her parents knew with absolute certainty that this was wrong. Lola had never shown any interest in romantic relationships. She and her mother had a close, trusting bond, the kind where a daughter tells her mother everything. If there had been someone in Lola's life, Deline would have known. There was no one, and Lola would not simply disappear without a word. Johan, drawing on both his parental instinct and his practical access as the building's caretaker, turned to the one resource he had that the police had not yet used. He went directly to the building's security camera system and began reviewing the afternoon's footage with a focused urgency. What he found on that footage stopped him cold. The recording showed Lola arriving at the building at approximately 2:40 in the afternoon. She was not alone. Walking beside her was a woman in a gray jacket and light-colored trousers. Something about the woman's face tugged at the edges of Johan and Deline's memory. She looked faintly familiar, though neither of them could immediately place where they had seen her before. As the footage continued, what the camera captured was deeply disturbing. The woman maneuvered Lola toward the elevator with force. The elevator rose to the 6th floor. Once there, the woman led the child forcibly into one of the apartments. Johan wasted no time. He transferred the footage directly to police, and within hours, what had been a hesitant missing person inquiry became a full criminal investigation. Meanwhile, Deline turned to social media, posting a message asking for the public's help in locating her daughter. She described what Lola had been wearing that day: white jeans, a white hooded sweatshirt, and a gray backpack. The post spread quickly. The building's residents were questioned, and officers began a systematic floor-by-floor search of the entire 12-story structure. Every corridor, every stairwell, every storage room was examined. Lola was nowhere to be found. In the basement, however, investigators made a grim discovery: a cutting knife, a roll of adhesive tape, and physical evidence suggesting a struggle had taken place there at some point that day. These details were not made public at the time. Every person involved in the search, every officer and every neighbor, was still holding on to the hope that Lola would be found alive. That hope collapsed before the night was over. At approximately 11 o'clock that evening, a man who lived near the building passed through the courtyard of a neighboring residential complex. He noticed something that made him pause: two large suitcases, sitting upright inside a large refuse container, placed in a way that seemed almost deliberate, almost visible. Thinking, as most people would, that there might be something of value inside, he approached and opened the container. What he found was something no one should ever have to witness. Beneath layers of fabric and clothing, hidden inside those suitcases, was the body of a child. Police were called immediately. The child was identified within moments of their arrival. It was Lola Davier, 12 years old. The details that investigators pieced together in the hours and days that followed were deeply disturbing, even to the most experienced members of the forensic and investigative team. Reports indicated that Lola had been found without clothing. Her hands and feet had been restrained, and her face had been tightly wrapped in adhesive tape. Her small body bore numerous injuries. Different accounts in the days that followed varied in their specifics, but all were consistent in conveying the severity of what had been done to her. Some reports described serious injury to her neck, while others described additional trauma of a deeply troubling nature. It was also reported that the numerals 0 and 1 had been marked on the soles of her feet in red nail polish, though some accounts suggested the markings may have been applied directly to the skin. The forensic examination ultimately determined the cause of death. Lola had lost her life as a result of suffocation, caused by the tight wrapping of tape around her face. The other injuries, investigators established, had been inflicted after she had already passed. The sheer cruelty of the crime led investigators initially to consider whether personal animosity toward the child had played a role. They could find none. This appeared to be a random and devastating act of violence against a child who had never done anything to deserve it. At around 2 o'clock in the morning, police delivered the news to Johan and Deline. There are no words adequate to describe what that moment must have been like. Deline later spoke of the guilt that took hold of her immediately, the kind of irrational but inescapable guilt that every parent who has ever lost a child in sudden and violent circumstances knows all too well. She blamed herself for lying down that afternoon, for not being at the door when Lola was due home. She said that on most days she would have gone out to meet her daughter at that time. If she had, she said, she would have seen her. Those words, spoken months after the fact, carried the full weight of a grief that had no floor. Investigators returned to the city's extensive network of surveillance cameras, which cover Paris with a density and consistency that has proven invaluable in countless criminal cases. Reviewing footage from across the surrounding neighborhood and the hours following Lola's disappearance, detectives identified a crucial sighting. At approximately 5 o'clock in the afternoon on October 14, the same woman seen on the building's cameras, the woman in the gray jacket, appeared again. This time she was in the street outside the building, visibly struggling to pull a large container and 2 suitcases. The physical effort was visible. Witnesses from the area would later confirm what the cameras had captured, recalling that they had seen a slim young woman hauling heavy luggage, looking strained and behaving oddly. It had not occurred to any of them to intervene, because nothing about the scene, taken in isolation, had struck them as overtly alarming. People move suitcases. That is not unusual in a city of millions, but it was unusual enough in retrospect to stay in their memories. The identification of the woman moved quickly. She was Dabia Ben Khalrit, 24 years old, the younger sister of Faria Ben Khalrit, who resided in apartment 6 of the very same building where Lola's family lived and worked. Faria was brought in for questioning, and when shown the footage, confirmed that the woman in the images was her sister. Law enforcement moved swiftly and located Dabia in a suburban commune outside the city. She was arrested and taken into custody. During the initial stages of questioning, it emerged that her residency visa had long since expired. Born in Algeria in 1998, Dabia had first come to France in 2016, traveling with her sister on a student visa. The two had initially lived with their mother in a small apartment above a restaurant, before later moving to a larger residence. Dabia had enrolled in a culinary training program, but never completed her studies. One of her instructors later described her as someone who was almost chronically absent and who had a troubling relationship with the truth, someone for whom dishonesty appeared to be a reflex rather than a choice. According to Feria, the early years in France had been especially difficult for their family. Their mother had become gravely ill with cancer, and her death cast a long shadow over both sisters. After losing her, Feria remained in the apartment they had shared, a unit that was formally registered in the name of someone who had left the country, meaning that Feria's occupancy was itself irregular. Like her sister, she was in France on an expired visa, supporting herself through occasional work, including shifts at a local bakery. Dabia's immigration situation had escalated significantly over the years preceding the tragedy. Beginning in 2017, she had submitted multiple applications for asylum in France. Each one had been refused. Those refusals had resulted in two separate orders requiring her to leave French territory. The first came in 2019, following the expiration of her student visa. The second arrived on August 2, 2022, just 10 weeks before Lola's death, when Dabia was apprehended at Orly Airport in Paris without valid travel documents or a plane ticket. Despite being detained at the airport on that occasion, she was not held in custody. Instead, authorities issued an obligation to leave the country within 30 days. She did not leave. Subsequent reporting also raised significant questions about how, given her undocumented status, Dabia and her sister had at some point been allocated social housing in Paris. Those questions would become central to a broader national conversation in the weeks and months that followed. The relationship between the two sisters had, by October 2022, deteriorated significantly. Feria later described her younger sister as someone who had been struggling with serious psychological difficulties for some time. The tensions between them had eventually reached a point where Feria asked Dabia to leave the apartment. Without a stable address, Dabia had been staying with various acquaintances and had effectively become homeless in the period leading up to the events of October 14. When Feria gave her account to investigators, she described Dabia as someone who had always been a source of difficulty for those around her, even during the years when their mother was gravely ill and the family needed to pull together. She also disclosed that Dabia had developed a dependency on controlled substances, a habit that had worsened over time and made coherent communication with her increasingly difficult. Feria's account of the evening of October 14 proved essential to the investigation. When she returned home that afternoon, she found the apartment in a state of considerable disorder, the kind of disarray that she had come to associate with her sister's presence. At around 10:30 that night, Dabia arrived at the apartment. She had with her a large container and two suitcases. She was visibly agitated and immediately asked Feria to help her take the items out of the building. Feria asked several times what was inside. Dabia refused to say. Despite her unease, Feria helped carry the items to the courtyard of a neighboring building. She would later admit to investigators that, even at the time, a terrible suspicion had crossed her mind. She had not acted on it. The exact nature and extent of her knowledge on that evening would become one of the more legally contested points in the case, though ultimately investigators focused their criminal case entirely on Dabia. Other witnesses from the building and the surrounding area added further detail to the reconstruction of that evening. Neighbors recalled seeing Dabia enter the building alone in the early afternoon, leave shortly afterward, and then return approximately 30 minutes later with a suitcase. Several people noted that she had exchanged a few words with residents she passed, but that there was something in her manner that felt off, a visible strain in her movement, a tension in her bearing that did not fit the ordinary rhythm of someone simply moving belongings. The suitcases appeared heavy. No one considered, even for a moment, that they might contain anything other than household items or clothing. After leaving the building, Dabia contacted a male acquaintance, a 43-year-old man named Amin, who collected her and took her to his apartment in one of Paris's outer suburbs. She remained there for several hours before eventually calling a taxi late that night and returning to Feria's apartment. Both Amin and the taxi driver later told authorities that they had no knowledge of what had been concealed in the container. In total, 6 individuals were formally questioned in connection with the case: Dabia herself, her sister Feria, Amin, the man who had discovered the container in the courtyard, and at least 2 others with varying degrees of connection to Dabia. When all the evidence was laid out, however, it pointed in one direction only. Every thread led back to the same person. Feria was deported from France in December 2022. On October 17, formal charges were filed against Dabia, accusing her of unlawful killing and a series of additional serious offenses committed with extreme cruelty. She was transferred to Fleury-Mérogis prison, one of the largest detention facilities in Europe, and placed in solitary confinement. In the days and weeks that followed, her behavior inside the facility became increasingly troubling. She was reported to have harmed herself repeatedly, striking her head against the walls of her cell, injuring her hands, cutting her hair in an erratic manner, and behaving aggressively toward prison staff. In February 2023, she was transferred to a secure psychiatric facility for evaluation and treatment. The question of Davier's mental state would become central to the defense strategy in the months ahead. Several forensic specialists conducted assessments over the course of the pretrial period. Their collective conclusion was pointed. Davier was not suffering from psychosis. She did not have a significant mood disorder. No psychiatric diagnosis had emerged that could account for, mitigate, or explain the events of October 14. She was identified as someone with a pronounced tendency toward pathological fabrication, someone who constructed elaborate false narratives as a reflexive strategy for avoiding accountability. That characteristic became starkly visible when Davier appeared in court during a preliminary hearing in June 2023. Her account of events was almost unrecognizable when compared with the physical evidence and the testimony of witnesses. She claimed that Lola had voluntarily followed her into the building, and that once inside, the child had become nervous and agitated. What followed in Davier's telling was casual and minimizing. She said she had struck the child a little, that she had not been feeling well herself, that she had done what she felt she had to do and had perhaps gone too far, and that she had simply wanted to feel pleasure. The cold detachment embedded in that statement was noted by everyone present in the courtroom. Johan publicly and directly contradicted one of the claims at the core of Davier's account. She had suggested in her version of events that she had followed Lola into the building because Deline had refused to give her access to the building's keycard. Johan addressed this flatly. In an interview, he stated that no such interaction had ever taken place. According to the security footage he had personally reviewed, Davier had entered the building first, and Lola had followed behind her. Everything else Davier was saying, he made clear, was a lie. The forensic findings confirmed everything the camera footage had suggested and more. Davier was competent. She understood her actions. There was no clinical basis for any diminished responsibility argument. The investigation, the forensic science, and the witness accounts converged completely. In cases involving crimes of this nature, especially those that appear on the surface to lack a clear and rational motive, the public tends to search desperately for an explanation, some framework, however uncomfortable, that allows a degree of sense to be imposed on the senseless. The case of Lola Davier was no different. Several theories circulated in the immediate aftermath, some driven by genuine concern, others by political intent, and a few by outright misinformation. One prominent voice, a former government minister, suggested at one point that the nature of the crime and the particular details discovered on Lola's body might be consistent with practices sometimes described in connection with certain superstitious beliefs documented in parts of North Africa, involving the belief in the unusual properties attributed to certain individuals. Investigators addressed this directly and dismissed it entirely. There was no evidence to support such a theory. It had no bearing on the case and was not pursued further. The crime appeared to have no ideological, ritualistic, or premeditated basis rooted in any belief system. It appeared to be a brutal and devastating act carried out by a deeply troubled individual. The killing of Lola Davier sent a profound shockwave through the 19th arrondissement and far beyond. Parents who had never thought twice about their children walking home from school began escorting them to and from the school gates. Neighbors who had once left their doors slightly ajar in the easygoing style of apartment building communities began locking them firmly. The school Lola had attended arranged immediate psychological support for students and staff in the days following the discovery. François Dagnox, the mayor of the 19th arrondissement, expressed the grief of the entire community, describing what had happened as a tragedy for the school, for the district, and for the whole of Paris. President Emmanuel Macron met personally with Lola's family and described the crime publicly as an act of extreme evil. One of Lola's closest friends, speaking with the fragile honesty of a child trying to make sense of the incomprehensible, said that she was struggling to understand it, that it would probably only get harder as time went on, that mornings without Lola would be difficult, and that the whole thing felt unreal because just the Friday before, they had been laughing together. Public response, though uniformly grief-stricken in its emotional core, was not unified in its political expression. A significant portion of French society directed their anger at the state, arguing that the immigration enforcement system had failed Lola by permitting someone who had received 2 lawful deportation orders to remain on French soil. The argument was pointed. If the law had been applied consistently, Davier would not have been in Paris on October 14. Lola would have come home. Her parents, however, took a conscious and deliberate position on this front. They did not want Lola's name, her memory, or her tragedy to become a vehicle for political point scoring. They asked the public to respect that. Despite their wishes, Lola's death did become a flashpoint in the broader immigration debate. Demonstrations were held in her memory, including events organized by supporters of politician Eric Zemmour, who used the case to press for stricter enforcement of immigration laws. The government acknowledged that enforcement systems needed to be strengthened. Inside the National Assembly, the debate was sharper and more divided. Some legislators cautioned explicitly against allowing grief and outrage to drive immigration policy in the heat of the moment. One parliamentary statement framed it carefully, noting that France as a whole bore collective responsibility, both for the state of its deportation enforcement system and for the long decline of its psychiatric and social care infrastructure, and that making immigration the dominant lens through which to view a child's death risked distorting the decisions that actually needed to be made. The physical location where Lola's life was taken, and where her body was later found, became in the weeks that followed a quiet and deeply human memorial. Flowers accumulated against the walls of the building. Cards, drawings, and soft toys were left by strangers who had never known her. Children from the neighborhood, some of them too young to fully understand death, left behind their own small offerings. It was the kind of spontaneous communal mourning that speaks to something universal, the recognition that the loss of a child is a loss that belongs, in some sense, to everyone. Throughout the investigation and the pretrial period, the mental health questions surrounding Davier continued to evolve. The psychiatric evaluations that were conducted over many months ultimately reached a consistent conclusion. She was not psychotic. She was not suffering from any disorder severe enough to call her criminal responsibility into question. What the assessments did identify was a deeply entrenched pattern of deception, of building false realities to protect herself from consequences. It was a character profile that was consistent with everything the investigation had already revealed, and it pointed, clearly and without ambiguity, toward a calculated rather than impulsive crime. On October 24, 2025, 3 years after Lola's death, Dabiya Ben Khawrat stood before the court for the final time as the verdict and sentence were delivered. She was found guilty of all charges brought against her. The court sentenced her to life imprisonment with no possibility of parole. It was a sentence of extraordinary gravity and one that carried historic significance. It was the first such sentence handed down to a woman in France, since this form of life imprisonment without possibility of release was introduced into French law in 1994. The ruling was met, in the courtroom and beyond, with the particular silence that follows a verdict that is both expected and still somehow enormous to hear spoken aloud. Lola's brother Thibault, who had carried the weight of this loss in the public eye with a maturity and dignity beyond his years, addressed the outcome with restraint and clarity. He said that the family had received what they had come for. They had defended and restored Lola's memory. They had restored the truth. He thanked the court for justice and said the family was satisfied with the decision. In the weeks and months following the verdict, as they had done for 3 years, people continued to bring flowers to the building where Lola had lived and where her life had been taken. Lola's funeral had taken place on October 24, 2022, in the town where her mother had grown up, the kind of place that exists in the imagination as quiet and green and far removed from city streets. The ceremony had been open to members of the public who wished to pay their respects, though the burial itself was a private family matter. Hundreds came in person. Thousands more expressed their love and solidarity from a distance. After Lola's death, Johan Davier had spoken with an openness and a directness that could only come from a man who had nothing left to lose and everything left to feel. He said that he was simply existing, going through the days because he had to, because his wife needed him, because his sons needed him, because his mother was watching. He said that it had been more than a year and he was still broken. He described the life he and Deline had built as a happy one, and then he said that October 14 was now with him forever. He called Lola his love and said she would always be the love of his life. On February 23, 2024, Johan Davier died. He was 49 years old. Reports attributed his death to a heart attack, though those who had known him and watched him through the months of grief, the media appearances, the court proceedings, and the relentless effort of simply carrying on understood that the causes were not purely physical. His health had deteriorated significantly in the time since Lola's death. He had struggled with his mental and emotional well-being, and by some accounts had returned to alcohol as a means of surviving a grief that had no visible end.